Someone lies to a partner for years, gets caught completely red-handed, and somehow still leaves the conversation convinced they're the actual victim. Not performing innocence. Not manipulating in that moment. Genuinely, fully believing it. This exact pattern shows up again and again in people with strong narcissistic traits. And there's a real clinical term for the mechanism driving it: narcissistic injury. It was first described by psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut, and it's more specific than most people assume. This isn't simply being an ego or arrogant. It's a self-image that's genuinely fragile underneath. Today we're covering this in 3 parts: what's underneath it, why accountability feels dangerous, and how it actually plays out. By the end, you'll understand why some people would rather burn a relationship down than admit fault. Let's start with what's actually happening underneath that confident exterior. Psychoanalyst Otto Kernberg spent decades studying pathological narcissism in real clinical settings. His research found something counterintuitive. The grandiosity often isn't excess self-love at all. It's frequently a defense, built to protect a self-image that feels conditional and fragile underneath. That self-image has to be defended constantly, because deep down, its worth doesn't feel secure. Kohut gave a name to any perceived threat against that fragile self-image: a narcissistic injury. And a narcissistic injury doesn't register as normal criticism. It can register as an actual threat. This is why even small, reasonable feedback can sometimes trigger a wildly disproportionate reaction. The reaction was never really about the specific comment. It's about the crack it puts in the image. Kohut also described what tends to follow a narcissistic injury: narcissistic rage. It's a real, documented response, defensive anger aimed at eliminating the perceived threat entirely. That threat isn't a person, exactly. It's whatever exposed the gap between image and reality. So the anger, blame, or coldness that follows isn't really about you, specifically. It's a self-image protecting itself from something it experiences as genuinely dangerous. Kernberg also described a related process: splitting, seeing people as entirely good or entirely bad. The moment someone points out a flaw, they can flip categories instantly, from good to bad. There's rarely a nuanced middle ground held for very long inside this particular pattern. That's the underlying mechanism. Now let's get into exactly why accountability feels so dangerous here. You might already know cognitive dissonance from an earlier video, the discomfort of holding 2 conflicting beliefs. Psychologist Leon Festinger showed people resolve that discomfort fast, often by rewriting the story. For most people, dissonance is uncomfortable. For this pattern, it can feel closer to unbearable, because the 2 conflicting beliefs aren't small. One is, I am fundamentally good and superior. The other, if accountability is accepted, becomes, I did something genuinely wrong. For a fragile self-image, holding both of those at once can feel like an internal collapse. So instead of adjusting the belief, the far easier move is adjusting the story around it. The fault gets relocated somewhere else, almost automatically, and often instantly. This isn't usually a slow, calculated lie. It's frequently a fast, automatic psychological reflex. Accepting fault would mean sitting with a version of themselves they cannot tolerate seeing. So the mind simply doesn't let that version become real and rewrites events instead. This is why apologies from this pattern, when they happen, often feel strange or incomplete. I'm sorry you feel that way protects the self-image while still sounding like an apology. A real apology requires briefly holding I was wrong, and that's the exact thing being avoided. To an outside observer, this can look like obvious dishonesty or manipulation. From the inside, it frequently doesn't feel like lying at all. It feels like self-preservation. That distinction matters, because it explains why confronting someone with facts rarely works. You're not up against a lie they know they're telling. You're up against a threat they're defending from. That's why accountability feels dangerous here. Now let's look at exactly how this plays out in practice. Researcher Jennifer Frade studied a specific pattern that shows up constantly in these situations. She named it DARVO: deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. It's a real, documented response pattern, and once you know it, you start seeing it everywhere. Step 1 is deny. The event either didn't happen, or it didn't happen the way you're describing it. Step 2 is attack. Focus shifts fast, onto your character, your memory, or your motives instead. Step 3 is reverse. The original offender repositions themselves as the actual victim in the story. Suddenly you're the one being accused of overreacting, attacking, or being unfair. The conversation that started about their behavior somehow ends with you defending yourself. This shift can happen within a single sentence, and it's often disorienting in the moment. You can walk away from a real conversation feeling confused about who actually did what. That confusion isn't a coincidence. It's frequently the actual function of the reversal. If the story becomes, "you're the problem," the fragile self-image never has to face the alternative. This is also where blame shifting toward specific people tends to become consistent and repeated. A pattern often emerges. Certain people become the reliable explanation for everything that goes wrong. A difficult ex, an unreasonable boss, a toxic friend who somehow keeps recurring across every story. When the same explanation shows up across many different relationships, that's worth genuinely noticing. Because most people, across enough situations, are occasionally at fault for something themselves. A total absence of that, across years and multiple relationships, is itself a meaningful data point. Kernberg also noted that praise and criticism aren't processed evenly inside this pattern. Compliments tend to be absorbed instantly, almost effortlessly, as simple confirmation of the self-image. Criticism gets rejected, deflected, or reassigned because it threatens that same self-image directly. It's not that feedback is being weighed and dismissed. It's often not truly being let in at all. That's how this actually plays out, from denial through reversal to repeated, consistent blame shifting. So what does this actually mean for someone who's on the receiving end of this pattern? First, this isn't something you caused, and it's very rarely something you can talk someone out of. A fragile self-image defending itself isn't persuaded by better evidence or a calmer tone. Trying harder to be understood usually isn't the missing piece here, even though it feels like it should be. Second, notice the DARVO pattern itself, not just this one specific conversation in isolation. Deny, attack, reverse. Once you can name each step, it becomes far easier to see clearly. Naming it in the moment, even quietly to yourself, can interrupt the confusion it's designed to create. Third, pay attention to patterns across time, not just any single incident on its own. One difficult relationship happens to anyone. A consistent pattern across many is different information. Fourth, your own memory and perception are allowed to stay valid, even under active pressure. Writing things down or talking them through with someone outside the situation can help preserve that. Fifth, accountability from this pattern, when it happens, tends to be rare, brief, and often self-serving. It's reasonable to notice that, without needing to explain away why it keeps happening that way. None of this means every difficult person has clinical narcissism. Most people get defensive sometimes. The difference is consistency. How often, how automatically, and how completely fault gets relocated. So here's a quick recap of what we actually covered today. A fragile self-image gets protected through narcissistic injury, narcissistic rage, and splitting. Accountability feels dangerous because it threatens that image at a genuinely deep level. And DARVO, deny, attack, reverse, is the real, documented pattern that plays this out. If any part of this matches something you've actually lived through, that reaction makes complete sense. Consider sharing this with someone who might finally have language for a pattern they've lived with. If this helped you understand a difficult pattern more clearly, subscribe for more honest psychology breakdowns.